interview me.
Yes. Fire away. Why did you leave Ireland?
Well, I'll tell you, I think, to be honest, the most important question is for me, when did I leave Ireland? Because the truth is, I left Ireland in November 1987. I did not get accepted to college when you all did, because I didn't know this at the time, but they forgot to add on the results of my oral Irish. Do you remember this, Miriam?
Yes.
And as far as I was concerned, I had failed honours Irish, and you needed Irish back then to get into university. So I packed my bags, didn't tell my parents that I was leaving because I thought they would talk me out of it. Contacted an aunt in Australia. She paid for my ticket. And then when my parents found out 2 weeks before I left, sure enough, there was a bit of guilt inducement. But I left Ireland in 1987 in November, intentionally leaving for good. And I was very bitter, I'll be honest. I was very angry. I was very upset because I thought that Ireland had been very unfair to me. And you know, in hindsight, it was pure immaturity as well. My twin sister Margaret got into college, and I didn't. And I felt.
You did not know the basis of your results?
No, I didn't. I thought I'd failed the Irish. I felt stupid.
Okay.
I felt like a failure. I felt stupid.
How long did you stay away for then?
I stayed away. At that point, I came and I did some babysitting and cleaned houses. And I stayed away for, I think it was almost a year. And it was the best thing I ever did, because I went back to college and I was loaded. I had so much money that my brothers.
I guess obviously that point they rectified the mistake that they had made.
What actually happened was about 6 months after I got notified by the teacher who taught Irish, Sheila McLaughlin, that she had done some investigation and that she had found out they had forgotten to add on the oral Irish results, and that I had gotten an honour in honours Irish, so that they were deferring my placement for a year. It was their fault. So I ended up starting university a year behind it.
When you graduated from university then, why then did you leave? Why did you not stay in Ireland?
Why did I leave? Because I got a taste of America and I wanted to go. I was one of those people. Money.
Money.
You know what it was? I saw opportunity. And I think, I'll be very honest with you, if you remember, I went to England for a few months as well to work with you guys. And I liked London, don't get me wrong, I liked London. But the Irish were in this part of America, they adored the Irish. The Irish accent was like, they were enamored with it. And I loved that, I really did. And I was really scared in London because the IRA were going crazy bombing just before Christmas. And I was ashamed of being Irish at points. I think I told you that there was one stage when I was on a train going to visit Marcella, and it was supposedly a fast train, and if we were on it, it was like an hour sitting on the tracks not moving because they were defusing a bomb. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And this woman sat opposite me, and she was going, bloody Irish.
She was in the shops when the bombs blew.
And I was absolutely terrified, and I was embarrassed about being Irish. I was ashamed about being Irish.
Then you found conditions better in America than you did find either in London or in Ireland.
Well, I'll be honest, I found London good because there was a paycheck. I liked the independence of living away from home, having money, but I really missed living in a house. I did not like living in that small room in the hotel, not at all. I'm not a city person, even though London is a beautiful city. I am not a city person. I like to go visit a city, but I like to go home to the country.
Now, would you go back to Ireland based on that?
I certainly will never move back to Ireland.
Based on your circumstances here, or you do not want to go back?
I do not want to go back to Ireland. I remember when my mother was alive, and we bought land in Ireland with the intention of moving back there, like as a summer home or whatever, when we were older. And she said, would you not think of coming back for good? And I said to her, and this was after about 3 years of living in America, and I'd been married for a year now at that point. I said, do you remember how hard I cried when I was leaving Ireland for good? And she said, yeah. And I said, multiply that by 10 if I had to come back. And it's not that I hate Ireland, and it's not that I have any animosity towards it. I don't feel that I was driven out, but for some reason, in my heart and soul, I knew I was born to immigrate. I wasn't meant to stay in Ireland. I felt confined in Ireland. I felt there was no opportunities.
But I think because based on like 20 years ago and today, that times have changed.
Absolutely not.
Does it change?
I think absolutely not. I think the government has actually shown us how corrupt it is.
But this is not, isn't that just based on a small minority? I mean, the people themselves are still the same or changed for the better?
Yeah, but the thing is, even though we have a vote, I really don't think, unless, as you said, unless the people revolt and do something drastic like what they're doing in Egypt or did in the streets of London, not that I'm advocating that, but we need...
They're in New York at the moment.
And they're doing it in New York, exactly. I think that the Irish are very complacent.
Yes.
And I think that we need to be put more... Now, I think it's wonderful that we haven't gone out and kicked down windows of shops or anything like that. But I think that we need to shake up our government. They need to shake up the government. The government has led the Irish people astray, and it has used the Irish people as like a cash cow. And there's an elitist attitude in Ireland that is so wrong. I mean, there's jobs that are just cushy jobs, and you go into them for life because they're cushy, because you won't be worked to death, and you'll have a pension, a good pension for the rest of your life. And I think, in all fairness, some of the things that have happened since the boom came to an end is a good thing. Others, of course, it's bad. It highlighted the greed that came out of the boom. But I do think that there were certain jobs that were protected in Ireland for too long, and that there was a real sense of it's not what you know, it's who you know that was more important.
I think that has gone on most places.
I don't think so, not in America. I really don't. I think if you wanted to be, if you wanted to be a journalist in America, you could do it. But in Ireland, it was such, and I think too, it's because we're an island and we're insular and we're isolated in a way, and we have only X number of seats in universities for a huge population. Now, maybe that has changed, but do you remember how competitive it was to get into university? It was very competitive. The pressure was great, and maybe that has changed now, but I do remember that the leaving cert itself, when we were doing our final exam in secondary school, high school, 1/3 of the people doing the leaving cert got into university, and then 1/3 of that group actually graduated. It was what the statistics back then. And if you look at our picture, I hate saying this, but if you look at our picture, Miriam, the statistics are they're accurate. They are accurate because I think out of the...
I suppose my question is then, based on that photograph that you're talking about, isn't everyone's circumstance, everyone has like a story behind...
That's right.
All links back to immigration, do you think, or is it based on individual choice? A lot of these they stayed in Ireland, gone on welfare, and maybe subsequently become part of the Celtic Tiger.
No, I really don't. I think everything boils down to choice, but I also think that in your gut, if it doesn't feel right, you simply won't do it. And to me, staying in Ireland, my gut instinct said, I cannot do it. I can't do it. Now, I'm not saying it was easy to leave. And, there's one question I need to ask you as well towards the end. I forgot to ask you, and I'll answer it myself now first. It's not easy to leave. The advice that I would give people who are leaving today is do not expect Ireland to remain stagnant. It's not going to not change, and your families are not going to not change. I think the biggest shock that I got was 3 years after being away. I hadn't been home for about 2 years because we were saving money for a house and what have you. And I went back, and my brother Michael came out to the house, and I hadn't seen him in 2 years. And to me, it was the blink of an eye. and he'd gone grey overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember hugging him in I remember hugging him in the sitting room and walking into the kitchen and just crying my eyes out because you realise I'm getting obsessed.
Well, time goes by.
But you, as an immigrant, that is the most difficult part of immigration. You were missing out on an awful lot. And I think if you can't handle that, stay home. Because it is a big chunk of your life that you're giving up. I have missed out on seeing nieces and nephews grow up, get married, have their own children. I couldn't be there when my mother was dying, really. I couldn't be there for certain things that I wanted to be there for. And
it has something to do with your own regret as opposed to being forced out of a country that had no jobs for you. I mean, at the end of the day,
but the thing is,
like if you were working here in America, that like if you had money, you could easily. Because New York, for me, I find just to go on, it's so we're close to Ireland that if you want to go home, you can go home.
Yeah, but you see, for me, I found it easier because of that lump in my throat when I saw how, I guess the Celtic Tiger for me made it easier because things were changing so fast in Ireland. It wasn't home anymore. But for those first 3 years, I missed Ireland a lot. And it was easier for me not to go home that often because I didn't have to deal with the homesickness. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I deliberately, see, Anne said that she doesn't understand the sentimentality of it, but I do. I do understand the sentimentality of it. My only way of dealing with that is not to go back that often because inevitably, when I sit on that airplane when I'm coming home, and Kevin will tell you this, I get very quiet. I can't talk for about half an hour.
And then it's coming back from Ireland?
Coming back from Ireland because I know things will change. And I have it's not going to change any differently or I can have any control over it, even if I'm there.
Doesn't everybody change?
Doesn't everybody change? And I think it's just the inevitability of they're going to change, we're all getting older, and that's just the way it is. And I think that's the biggest part about being an immigrant. You cannot be there for everything. So I'll finish this. You've interviewed me now.